And
Yes, sir.
now we move on to the next paper of the session by a young person, Anirudh Naveen, and a very modern topic, contemporary topic. He is talking about how art was used in Indian national movement, uh, and what were the aesthetic layers of image creation during national movement, visual creations. Anirudh Navinji.
So namaste to one and all present out here. Firstly, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Indic Academy and especially to Nagaraji for giving me this opportunity. I'm Anirudh Naveen and I'm a first year student of history, presently studying in Hansraj College, University of Delhi. And today I shall be exploring this particular theme titled Unraveling the Aesthetic Layers of the Indian National Movement, an Artistic Study. So let me first set some context for this particular topic and why did I opt for this topic. So if we look at the conventional narratives of modern Indian history or modern Indian political history, we generally consider, civil disobedience movement, non-cooperation movement, or certain political figures, speeches, books, and all such stuff. But what often goes missing and what often is ignored is the aesthetic basis for this whole concept of nationalism. How did people come together? How did this mobilization towards a concept like a nation working for or striving towards nationhood or striving towards independence, how did that even come to be? If we need to study that, we need to study aesthetics. We need to study poetry, literature, art, music, dance, and all such forms that had a terrific impact, a tremendous impact on the way people thought, on their sensibilities, and overall on the way they behaved and the way they on their actions itself. Out here, I'm basically going to look at art alone. What was the artistic response to colonialism? How did painters in the early 20th century interpret art as a vehicle for nationalism? That is exactly what I want to study. And here in this study, it's a very brief and a very preliminary account of the Bengal School of Art that flourished in the early part of the 20th century and had a terrific impact on the impulses and on the events that took place even after a decline of that particular school of art. So I'd like to move on to the next slide, please. Great. So the Bengal School of Art emerged as an avant-garde to oppose academic realism and colonial attitudes. So this concept avant-garde is very important, and it was very important for those times as well. So as you all know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the colonial power had rooted itself firmly in India and across a lot of countries in the world. And as a reaction to that, you had a fresh systems of art, new schools of art emerging across the world. And this response, anytime when there's a response to a particular agitation or any particular activity, some oppression, that is called as an avant-garde, and it came to oppose academic realism. Now what is academic realism? Academic realism is a philosophy. If you look at it from a ground level, it's a philosophy, it's a way of thinking rooted in Western perspective. Now what does that mean? When we look at an image, let's say when we look at a flower, for us the flower is as it is and we would like to represent it like that. So it is something that is rooted in the concept of realism and is distinctly different from an Indian perspective that was argued later, which was idealism. So this emerged to oppose these colonial attitudes. And it reached its zenith. This particular school of art reached its zenith during the Swadeshi movement, which lasted roughly from about 1905 to 1911. Although the Swadeshi movement did move on and continue to, stimulate opinions and continue to bring about a lot of regeneration over a period of time, this was the phase when it was most active. And it emerged in the context of the anti-partition agitation starting in 1905. The partition of Bengal, after that, is when you saw this movement for a revivalist art reaching a new height. And what I'll be arguing is how this revivalist art was rooted in Hindu iconography, rooted in Hindu aesthetics as well. So artists began making political statements through their works. And the doyen for this particular school of art was Abanindranath Tagore, who was the nephew of Rabindranath Tagore. So the prominent artists and philosophers, and a lot of, I mean, especially Anand Kumar Swami, his name was taken by Sushant Bharti ji also earlier. He also played an extremely important role in this regeneration. And these works have been referred to for this particular paper because these are the only extant English sources available for reference to this period. So these are the artistic, behemoths of this period who were writing extensively on an Indic concept of art, including E.B. Havel, Sister Nivedita, who played a very terrific role, O.C. Obinendra Chandra Ganguly, Asit Haldar, and Abhinavanath Tagore himself. So the school thrust into limelight a generation of artists who strove to uphold Indian art. The whole concept of Indian art vis-a-vis Western art, that is what they sought to bring about. This, the Jorashanko household of the Tagores, was the base of this Bengal school. Next slide, please. Right. So now there's a trikona out here that is very interesting to note. This trikona is idealism, sacrality, and unity. And if we are to understand the regeneration that took place in the early part of the 20th century, it's very important to understand these concepts. Now, what is unity? For us, our notion of unity is largely political in nature. Okay, there is diversity in the country and we need unity. We need people to come together and believe in one concept or a few concepts, right? But here, if you go to see, this quest for unity was rooted in spirituality. And that is where the aesthetic element also comes in. So what did they emphasize on? In fact, all these three terms are very closely intertwined, so it's difficult to separate the three of them. But if you look at the whole emphasis on idealism as opposed to the concept of realism, what does idealism exactly mean? Idealism means moving beyond the apparent world that you see in front of you. This is exactly akin to the Vedantic notion of unity between the Atman and Brahman. So when a person sees any apparent reality in front of them, that is actually Maya. So when an artist is painting, then they should not look at the world as it is, but try to look deeper, look beyond what is in front of you. That is the very basis of an ideal art. So unity in the Indian context, and this is extremely important, it stemmed from a sacredness of all things, rather than a division between sacred and profane. This is exactly where the comparison between India and West comes into the picture, comes into limelight. So as Nagaraj also said in his introduction, he said that in India, this concept of religion is extremely, extremely different. And that is why this word sacred is of extreme importance out here. When we use the word sacred, we mean that every object around us is imbued with a distinct spirituality. So someone like Anand Kumar Swami, in his essays on national idealism, he mentioned this, that when you look at, if you look at Greek artwork, Greek sculpture, what you see an emphasis on hero worship. But when you look at Indian sculpture, when you look at Indian art, you see a great emphasis on yoga, on dhyana, and all these, metaphysical aspects that are clearly missing from the Western, in Western art, Western architecture. So this unity is something that all these artists, these revivalist artists, they emphasized upon. Now, alongside, the unity was not only, say, metaphysical in nature or philosophical in nature. It also had a geographical and political context. So this emerged particularly through the articulation of a pan-Asian aesthetic. Now, at this point of time, the early 20th century, there was a lot of churn happening across the world, especially in countries in Asia like Japan, China, Southeast Asia. All of them were also going through a lot of agitation. So in Japan, you had the Meiji Restoration, and after that, particularly in this early phase, you had a war with Russia that they won. Japan won in 1905, and it was a really uplifting war. It lifted a lot of spirits. This particular scholar, his name, as you can see in the picture, his name Kakuzo Okakura. He had a liaison with Sister Nivedita. Now we all know that Sister Nivedita came to India in the late 1890s, and under the guidance of Swami Vivekananda, she adopted this name. She was actually initially Margaret Noble and became Sister Nivedita after that. But what we see through this liaison is the articulation of an aesthetic that moves beyond national territories. That is how we can argue that this particular artistic revivalism was not nationalist or was not Indian in nature. It was in fact Oriental, and that's the difference between national and Oriental. So what did What did Kakuzo Okakura write in his book? And this Ideals of the East is a book published in 1903. The introduction was written by Nivedita. He said that Buddhist and Hindu art, as seen in Ellora, inspired the Buddhist art of Tang, China, and Kyoto. So India was like the fountainhead of all other, philosophical growth and all other sculptural growth seen later on, right? So their understanding of history was such that ancient India was all about the Buddhist and Hindu architecture, art and architecture, which was deeply religious, deeply sacred in nature. Medieval India, where you had the Mughals who dominated, their idea of art was largely secular in nature, and so it was inferior to the art of the ancient India. Why was it inferior? Because it lacked that sacred quality. It lacked that idealism that was evident in the ancient art, right? So he also introduced, like the Borobudur temple, as you all might be knowing in Java, it's considered to be the peak of Oriental architecture. Now, Kakuzu Okakura also introduced the wash technique in Indian painting, and it's a very interesting technique wherein you're blending a lot of colors, and it provides a very hazy picture, but it provides a very deep, it has a very deep-rooted and evocative impact on the person who is viewing it. So this technique was introduced, and its most famous proponent was Abanindranath Tagore himself. And now we shall look at one such rendering that attained a lot of fame and still is of utmost importance for us. So please, next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, right. And this particular painting, Bharat Mata, right? We all know that Bharat Mata, for the first time, the concept of the notion of feminine and the notion of nation, that integration was done by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. And later on, of course, that Vande Mataram was a very, very, important case. But what Abanindranath Tagore did was to give a visual import to what was being said. So he gave this beautiful rendition of Bharat Mata. And this image was at the core of the Swadeshi movement, used in processions, rallies, Rakhi Bandhan Utsavs, and many other ceremonies taking place over there. Now, what is evident right up front? When we look at this image, we see a saffron-clad woman. We see her carrying, having 4 arms and carrying 4 distinct things in those, right? So we see a necklace, we see sheaves of wheat, we see books, and we see clothes. Now, all of this are representative, of course, symbolic of deeper aspects. Now, what the overarching figure that we get from this particular painting is spirituality, moving beyond what is given particularly in this picture. Now, this highlights a unique perspective on the feminine as well. Now, idea of feminine, and why I'm saying unique, I know that will raise eyebrows because it's something that's very integral to the Indian perspective. But this was a time when Indian art and the Indian way of life itself was being denigrated. So you had writers like O.C. Vincent Smith who was saying that India lacked a fine art tradition at all. There was no fine art tradition at all existing in India, even in ancient India. So this idea was not existing at that time, and to say such things, to bring out such a powerful image, required a lot of guts. So that is exactly what Abanindranath Tagore did. And Sister Nivedita earlier in 1898 had also written a book called Kali the Mother, and this can be considered as extending upon that. So 7 years later, this particular painting had been rendered, and this encapsulates the spiritual tenor of paintings made by the Bengal school artists at that particular time. And as can be seen with a comment made by Abanindranath Tagore much later in a memoir, when I made this painting, I had the face of my daughter in mind. Just shows how there was a conflation between humanity and divinity. There was no, rigid differentiation. There was, a kind of an intimacy between the two, and that is exactly what they were trying to bring out. This was the essence of Indian art, wherein there was no rigid difference between human beings and between the divine. There is a unity between them, and this unity was later on extended for political purposes as well, to showcase that in spite of all the diversity we see around in India, there is a unity, an underlying unity among all people. And as can also be seen by this painting being popularized by Subramaniam Bharati in Tamil region through his journal India. It's a very famous journal that he published in the Tamil region. It shows that it had a trans-Bengal impact. It was not confined only to Bengal. And that was the essence of this painting. It had a lot of visual force and visual power. So later on, of course, you had cartographic renditions. It got figured into a map and all that. So this painting it did not really last long. It lasted for a short time in public memory. But the whole conception of, feminine being elevated to the status of nationhood or being associated with the nation had been introduced by Abanindranath Tagore. Yes, sir. Please, next slide. Right. Now I come to the core of what my paper argues, which is that a distinct aesthetic was being developed at this particular point of time. And as I had informed you earlier as well, Abanindranath Tagore was the doyen of this.
This is the conclusion part of your paper, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Do I have to conclude it? Am I audible, sir? All right. So this is the Shadanga or the six limbs of painting, which is an article written by Abanindranath Tagore in 1914. And this has six different, the six limbs of Indian painting. And this has been, he borrowed this from the Kama Sutra. The Kama Sutra was, it was Yashodhara's commentary on the Kama Sutra, published around the 7th century AD. And he borrowed it from there. And his interpretation of this particular article is very interesting and gives us insights into the pulse of those particular times. So what were people thinking about the aesthetic ideas, Hindu aesthetic ideas, and how are they interpreting it in that particular context? Now, what is the meaning of Rupa Veda? Rupa Veda means form and difference. Now, when we look at objects around us, there is a lot of difference. And that difference, when we classify things as beautiful or grotesque, that largely comes across because we simply view things through our eyes. And what Abanindranath Tagore urges and exhorts people to do is to move beyond this quest of looking things only through eyesight and to use our mind, to use our ruchi. Ruchi is a concept he evolves in this process, saying that there is a ruchi in our minds and there is a ruchi in the objects. And only when there is a favorable connection between the two will there be a true association and a true understanding of beauty. So alongside, if we go to see the second one, which is pramanani, it's called as measurement. It basically means that you're able to understand the reality of things and are able to measure it properly. And here again, he evolves this whole, like he illustrates this using the example of an ocean. How does an artist represent an ocean on a piece of paper? Because it's just so vast. How can you possibly represent that on a piece of paper? Here's where you can use your Pramatri Chaitanya, which is a measuring faculty that is imbued in you. You just need to dive deep within and bring that spiritual idea out, and you can present that. So that is the Pramanani. It's another very extremely interesting concept, and his elucidation upon that is also very fascinating. The third part is Bhava or emotion. Here also, he urges a painter and a person who is the viewer also, to move beyond the emotions that are evoked through a painting at the outset, and to try and understand the deeper meaning, which is the Vyanga. So that Vyanga needs to be brought out. That is what he's trying to convey through Bhava. The fourth one is Lavanya Yojanam or grace. Now, every painting it requires this element of grace to ensure that the Bhava and Pramanani, when we talk of measurement, when we talk of emotion, an excess of that will not lead to a proper painting, will not lead to a wholesome painting. Thus, grace is extremely important in this particular context. That is where Lavanya Yojanam plays a role. Then you have Sadrishyam. Sadrishyam basically means similitude. Now, what does similitude mean in this case? It means that the impressions that you form in your mind, or the ideas that you have in your mind, and the form that it eventually takes, there needs to be a similitude between that. And once again, there is an overarching unity between the two concepts. That is again the whole idea of unity once again is seen over here. And finally, we have Varnika Bhanga, which means mixing of colors. So this is the eventual action. This is the when you put brush on paper, that is the action that really matters. So you need to muster that confidence. You need to have that accuracy and that you need to have that kind of capacity to sit and paint with dexterity. So that is exactly what is conveyed Varnika Bhanga. Then you have concepts like Rasa and Chanda that are introduced by Tagore in an appended section, wherein he strikes links between Indian and Japanese paintings, Indian and Japanese aesthetics. So here's where he says that Rasa and a concept called ki in Japanese are very closely linked. So this is a very important painting, and even the reaction to this is very revealing, because not everyone accepted this, with wholeheartedly. It was there were a group of like archaeologists, like Akshay Kumar Maitreya, who was very critical about this. He said that how can you give such a a very abstract definition for all of this? You need to be more concrete. You need to take more evidence from our Natya Shastras. You need to take more instances from the Chitra Sutras, and later on Stella Kranzlich, another artist philosopher, publishes this beautiful and very lengthy treatise called on the Vishnu Dharmottara. It's a commentary on the Vishnu Dharmottara, which is also worth reading because it gives you an understanding of what is the kind of aesthetic understanding that most of these philosophers are developing in this particular period of time. Yeah, I'd like to move on.
Thank you very much, Anirudh. It was really, we are more excited because you are so young, and
Sure.
our future of our Hindu aesthetics is safe in your hands. The posterity, the future generation. That was a wonderful study of a modern history of this country, uh, and it falls under art history, and also within art history most of the studies are based in western theories, but your paper is based in indic understanding, and you have shown how the artists themselves, and they themselves are art historians also, and they were self-conscious, and they were talking about their own art from an artistry point of view based in indic roots of understanding of the art, and you added your own indic perspectives in understanding this, uh, and particularly Indian national movement was a time when modernization of Indic roots was happening, and how it happened in the area of art is what you brought out excellently. Thank you very much for that.